talk today about the OODA loop for CISOs. So for those that didn't hear, Roselle Safran is my name, and my topic is the OODA loop for CISOs. And so just to give you a little bit of background on me, I started doing computer forensics in 2004, eventually moved to the Department of Homeland Security in a division that was then called US CERT. And there I was leading the malware analysis and forensic analysis teams. I was also the product owner for a threat intel platform before the term threat intel platform even existed. And then from there, I moved to the Executive Office of the President, and this was during the Obama administration. I was leading security operations. So I was responsible for the 24/7 SOC that was defending the White House's network. And there I was never too far away from the tactical side, but I tried to spend as much time as possible on the more strategic initiatives of improving visibility, bolstering defenses, and increasing efficiency. From my operational experience, then I saw where there were lots of technology gaps, and that's why I then shifted gears to the entrepreneurial side. My first cybersecurity startup that I founded and was the CEO of was called UpLevel Security. That was an incident response platform that was eventually acquired by McAfee. And I just, at the end of last year, launched my new cybersecurity startup, and that's Key Caliber. And this is more on the strategic side than my last startup. And it's focused on answering three big questions for security executives. What do I need to protect? How well am I doing? And how can I improve? And so I'm just mentioning all this background to let you know that I'm coming at this topic from many, many years of experience. So what is the OODA loop? So OODA just stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. This concept was originally developed by a colonel in the Air Force, and he had served in World War II and the wars in Korea and Vietnam. And while the initial application of the OODA loop was for a physical war, a physical attack environment, it translates very well to cybersecurity because at the end of the day, there are lots of similarities between what defenders are doing today and what adversaries are doing today, and how that can be like essentially a cyber war in a way. I don't want to use that word necessarily, but it's that concept. And so that's why the OODA loop applies very well. So what are the benefits of having an OODA loop? Well, first and foremost, it increases agility because you are able to respond as something happens and make changes and adapt and be resilient. And that's key to any type of fight. Secondly, it optimizes the decision-making process because you are not making decisions in a vacuum, that your decisions are informed by the earlier stages of the loop, the observe and orient steps. Thirdly, there is this continuous knowledge transfer. And what I mean by that is what happens in the observe step moves to the orient step. What happens in the orient step moves to the decision step. What happens in the decision step moves to the act step. And then it comes full circle again. So you don't have this silo of information, this silo of knowledge, and you can create this virtuous loop where what you're learning in any one stage can then impact the other stages and that first stage as you come back around. And fourthly, it enables constant improvement because you have this loop where you are constantly iterating and constantly improving and seeing what you're doing and the impact of what you're doing. And so there are lots of reasons why it's really helpful in a cybersecurity setting. Now, when we talk about the OODA loop in a security setting, we often think of it on the tactical side. And so the tactical OODA loop is very keenly focused on addressing immediate threats. I have an alert of this type, so that means I need to do X. And it optimizes for speed because on the tactical side, that's king. And it's very focused on the block and tackle side of operations, where you have something that's happening and you're reacting to it, and then that's coming back around so that you can then react the next time. So it's, relatively speaking, fairly narrow in scope, and it's specific to how the security team operates. The strategic OODA loop, the OODA loop for CISOs, has a very different focus. So instead of looking at what do I do with this attack that's just come in, it's more of a long-term project where you're looking at, well, how am I going to make us more efficient in the next 6 months or the next year? And the focus is more on optimizing your resources than just moving as quickly as possible. You have a given amount of resources, no matter what size of your organization, and you want to be able to use that most effectively. And you can do that if you are taking a strategic approach. So you're prioritizing projects, and you're prioritizing other high-level decisions. And so that requires a very big picture approach as opposed to the narrow scope of the tactical OODA loop. So as important and as helpful as an OODA loop is for organizations, there are lots of hurdles that prevent proper implementation. And I'm just going to go through a couple of them so you can sort of understand what you're getting into with it. And first and foremost is that the observe and orient steps don't keep up with the decide and act steps. There are decisions that need to be made on a regular basis. And if the process for gathering intel and figuring out how that applies to your environment is not a quick process, then you start to fall behind. Another issue is that decide and act can't be adequately measured. And this is in part due to the fact that observe and orient are happening too slowly. So you may have 3 decisions that are done before you have 1 observation, in which case you don't know which of those decisions and actions influence the observe that you're now seeing. Thirdly, the act portion of it often requires collaboration with other teams. So while the scope of the responsibilities of the security program have grown over the last few years, there are still plenty of organizations where they're in charge of security, but maybe not vulnerability management or access management or identity management. And in those cases, then it's a lot more tricky to incorporate those actions into the security program. And then fourthly, this is what bogs down everybody, is all of the manual processes that create bottlenecks, particularly when it comes to the observe and orient side of it. Often these high-level assessments that are done to understand the risk posture and the critical assets to operations, those are yearly exercises. And if they're done at that speed, where it's a yearly exercise where you have a team of people come in and they conduct interviews and questionnaires and spend lots of time on all these manual steps, then you're certainly not keeping up with the decision and action side of it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each step of the OODA loop, sharing some insights on how to apply them and apply them effectively. And now I can't be super prescriptive with this because every organization is different, but there are plenty of generalities that can apply to every organization. And that's what I'm going to cover here. So let's first look at observe. So when it comes to how often you have to observe, you want the cadence to at least match how often you are making decisions. Ideally, you can have it even more frequently than that, but that has to be the bare minimum speed. So an annual manual process is not going to cut it. You need to understand how frequently you think you're going to be making decisions and then make the observe and orient side of it even faster than that, because there are going to be times when you're going to have to decide even quicker than you normally do. Then another big aspect of observing is thinking not just about who your attacker is and what they're doing, but thinking about what you are doing internally and the complexity of your environment. So if we're looking at this as being similar to a war, Sun Tzu in The Art of War, that book, says it very well when he says, know thyself, know thy enemy, 1,000 battles, 1,000 victories. And that is to say that you have to understand yourself as well as you understand your enemies. And so much of that can be done with just leveraging the technologies that you already have in your environment. And you think of them as just being tactical, but those technologies can actually inform the Orient step that you need for the strategic side as well. And I'm going to get into those data sources just after this slide. And on the same token, the other side of the equation, you want to know yourself, you want to know your adversaries. And again, some of this information can be gleaned from your internal sources, and sometimes this is going to come from external sources. So looking at your data sources for understanding your own organization. So GRC data is often used, and so that's where you ideally have at least some understanding of the assets that are critical for your environment and the risks that are associated with your environment. But then there's a whole slew of very tactical data that's also super useful. So cloud and network data, so what's coming from your firewall, your IDS, your cloud management systems, that all gives you plenty of insight into your infrastructure and your outer layer of prevention and detection capabilities. Likewise, with application data, super important on the email side. We know that's a common attack vector. Understanding vulnerabilities, also super important. And it's very tactical in nature, but there are ways to apply that data from a strategic perspective as well. And then endpoint, of course, another area where having that intelligence, that data can be useful when you roll it up to the Orient step. Then for understanding your adversaries. So couple important points here. So threat intel comes in a variety of forms, but being able to understand who are the adversaries, what are their motives, what are they going after, what are the techniques that they generally use, whether it's a water hole attack or a spear phishing attack or something else. And some of that threat intelligence you'll be correlating yourselves if you have a threat intelligence team or you have threat intelligence capabilities. And sometimes that's just going to come from the outside, from feeds and other information sharing sources, so you can get the information you need that way. Another great source of data for understanding your adversaries is your alert and incident data. Especially if you have the threat intel associated with it, then you can start making attribution. But even if you don't, you can get an understanding of the type of attacks that are occurring and what type of assets are being attacked. So you could understand that, well, okay, they're going after our public-facing web servers. And that gives you lots of insight into what you need to do from a strategic standpoint. And open source data, of course, is also another great source for threat intelligence, for understanding adversaries. And some of this might not seem as obvious as you think. You think current events, industry news, that's not going to tell you about an attacker necessarily, but sometimes it very well can. Think about it with the number of attacks that have occurred in the last 6 months on organizations that are developing a vaccine. That's completely related to current events. And same with industry news, is when there's something that's announced, then that gets on everyone's radar, and that's something that needs to be part of your radar too. So now let's switch gears to the Orient step. So you have lots of data that you can observe, lots of data. Now, the Orient step is really where you bridge the chasm between what you're seeing and what you're deciding. And this, in some ways, is the trickiest for CISOs and other cybersecurity executives to create. And this is where you take what's usually tactical, but you flip it into something that is more strategic in nature. And you do that by looking at the big picture and understanding, okay, how does this data that I'm pulling in apply to what is critical to the operations of my organization? How does it apply to the mission functions, what we need to do on a regular basis, whether it's for a company making money or for a government agency providing the services that are needed? And then from a business continuity standpoint, with this asset, we have all this information about this asset and all the vulnerabilities associated with this asset. Is this an asset that I really care about because it is critical to my business functions, my business continuity? Or is this an asset that at the end of the day doesn't make a ton of difference whether there's a big problem with it or not? Then along those same lines of strategic importance, what's valuable to the organization? And this is often your data, whether it's your intellectual property, financial data, customer data, the PII, PHI, the list goes on of types of data that are meaningful and necessary for your organization. So when you're looking at that observed data, it's from the perspective of, okay, how does that affect what's important to us here? And if you look at these first two, they're very focused on essentially making money or doing the mission. And then the other side of it is saving money. And one of the big ways you can do that is by reducing risk. And so when data comes in from the observed step, the next step is to translate it into how that is important and what that means from this higher level perspective. And some of how you can make that translation is by slicing and dicing the data in different ways. An important way to do that is with aggregation. So it may not matter as much that you have 347 incidents in the last quarter. But if you start to slice and dice that data and you see that, 300 of those were spear phishing attacks to our R&D division. Well, now that's something that you can take a strategic action on based on the intel that you've observed. And then in a similar fashion, understanding trends. So seeing how something has changed over time and those time windows may vary, that can give lots of insight. If you're seeing, well, 3 months ago, we were doing all right with this. 2 months ago, we were doing all right with this, but last month, it's been a disaster. And then you can start to peel back the layers to that and understand what's been a disaster and how can we fix that so we don't continue on this downward trend. Then moving on to the decision side of it. So once you've figured out, okay, this is what I'm looking at, and this is what it means to my organization, then you want to make some decisions. And there are plenty of ways to do this. You can decide just based on the numbers on something that's going to, if you're working for a corporation, whether it's going to increase revenue, that often is a big factor. So security can be a revenue multiplier if the company is, for example, a technology product and there is an upsell offering for more security controls. Or it's a differentiator because it's better than its competition in providing security. Then there's also the risk reduction side of it. So with this, in the Orient step, you need to understand your current state and also your future state. So if you have a certain risk, well, what is that going to translate to from a dollars and cents perspective if you try to mitigate that risk. And then the other side of it, of course, is reducing costs. So that can be on the technology or people side of it, and you can also reduce costs by making processes more efficient. And now sometimes you end up combining some of these. So you can have a situation where, for example, you have a SOC and it's only working during business hours, and you're finding that you've just spent $500,000 on incident response in the last 6 months because all these attacks came in the middle of the night, and they ended up escalating by the time that the security team got in the next morning. So the decision may be, well, we're going to add 24/7 capabilities. So maybe we'll have another 2 or 3 people. That'll cost another $200,000 or $300,000. But we just spent $500,000 in the last 6 months alone. So that's going to be cost savings for us and reducing risk for us. Another way for basing decisions is on comparisons. So there are now several frameworks that are being widely adopted. The NIST cybersecurity framework is probably the most popular. CMMC is specific to the defense industrial base right now, but may expand beyond that. And CIS-20, that's been around for a long time, is also another one. So this is very useful, especially when you're looking at coverage and processes and comparing where you currently are. So you take your Orient step and you see where you are, and you can look at the framework to see where you want to go and make decisions accordingly. And another comparison that's often used is industry peers comparisons. Sometimes you can find information on this just in open source areas, and sometimes information sharing analysis centers, the ISACs and the ISOs are great places to get an understanding of what your peers are doing and how you stack up. And then the third way to make decisions is based on priorities. And it can be the priorities of other people that are influential in your organization. So your board of directors has their fiduciary responsibilities. They're often making their decisions, their cyber decisions based on perceived risk. Perceived risk and perceived the way they see it may not be the same as the actual risk. And that's one of the big challenges is the communication of that between the CISO and the board. The CEO's priority is going to basically be the bottom line. And so there are going to be times when that's going to be the order of the day. And if the CISO reports to the chief information officer, the chief security officer, the chief risk officer, then they're going to have their own compliance that they need to focus on, or they may have accountability because they've already promised the CEO or the board that they're going to do X and Y. And so you probably look at this and you think, well, if I'm deciding based on what others are prioritizing, then what difference does it make what I observe and I orient on, because I'm just going to have to decide based on what they want. And that's not the case, because if you have your observe and orient side complete, then you can have a conversation about their priorities. They may, the board or the CEO may see something in the news and get all interested in that being addressed first. But if you have your observe and orient done, and you say, I understand why you think that's a concern, but that actually only affects one machine that is not very heavily used versus this other risk that we know is affecting 475 machines, and a fraction of them are involved in mission critical operations. So we want to prioritize that, and then we'll get to your priority second. You can have more of those kinds of conversations if you are coming into the discussion armed with the knowledge that you are developing in the other steps of the OODA loop. Then you get to actually taking action. And this is where all the other steps that you've already done comes into play, and you can wrap it up very nicely in a bow. So when you're making decisions and taking actions, I love this approach of saying, we have X, which is what you observed, which means Y, which is how it orients in your specific environment. So we will accomplish the Z, this is the decision we've made, by doing A, and that is the action that you're taking right now. And just think about how powerful that is when you are going into any conversation, whether it be with those above you or those on your team, if you can justify all of your actions with this empirical knowledge and these facts that give lots of context behind why you're doing what you're doing. It makes the whole conversation very different. You go from having this amorphous decision-making process to one that is methodical and well supported. And when you are taking actions, I really like being able to track each action. So that to me is answering the 4 big questions. What? So that's your decision and your action. Why? And that comes from the observe and orient steps that support your decisions and actions. Who, which is who's going to be responsible for making sure this action actually happens. And when, that's putting a starting point and an end point on it. And when you're doing that when side of it, yeah, keeping track of the status of the project is also really important. Now, I don't include how in here because often that's going to be based on what who wants to do. And so I think in some cases it doesn't help to be that precise about the how, because there may be different ways to approach it, and the person responsible is ultimately the one that's going to make those decisions. But you do need to track the what, why, who, and when. Now, just a few tips to wrap it up. So that's the general gist of going through the whole OODA loop. To make this whole process as smooth as possible, first I would say is look at each step of the process and try to build out that capability. Particularly that orient step becomes a big hurdle for organizations to get over, where they've got plenty of observed data, but just translating that into something that means something to them, that's a challenge. And sometimes the best way to incorporate that meaningfulness is with putting some numbers behind it. So having your key performance indicators and metrics that you're using. So you're aggregating your data, you're taking your trends, and you're looking at what makes the most sense based on the data that you have and what you want out of that data. And then this is very specific to the challenge of working with other teams, I would well document the entire process of how you will interact with those other teams. So it's very clear what they will be expecting from you and what you will be expecting from them. And I've found that has helped lots. When I was on the operational side, I'd come in and there was all this ambiguity around how a process took place. And I would say, okay, we are setting up a standard operating procedure. This is what it is. Do you agree on it? They would maybe come back with edits, maybe just accept it. And at that point, we were both working off the same document. Everything was a much smoother process. And then the final recommendation I would make is to automate as much of this as possible. Obviously, this is a very detailed process. And if you want to be quick and nimble and do this repeatedly and frequently, then there needs to be a heavy level of automation involved, particularly with taking that observed data and translating it into something that orients to what you need from a strategic standpoint. So with that said, that's all I have for today. I am happy to answer a couple of questions now, and please feel free to reach out to me at any point if you have questions about any of this. As you can probably tell, I can talk about this for a very long time. So thank you all.
Hey, Roselle, that was great. Thanks a lot. One of the things that I see is, I hear the OODA loop being used on a lot of different areas, but I think this was really poignant because I could see it being applied. And you've kind of given us the flight plan but how much runway do we need? Like some of the aspects you've shown, I know are very difficult to accomplish inside of an organization. Something as simple as like the KPIs. How do we even get multiple business units to agree on the right KPIs? So you have any suggestions on that?
Well, with KPIs, I mean, you can start with ones that are just internal to what you're doing, and where you don't need to have any buy-in. They're just ones that you're using to figure out how you're going to improve your processes. I generally, when I look at metrics and KPIs, I bucket them into two categories. The ones that you're using internally to determine how you're going to improve and how you're going to move forward, and the ones that you are presenting externally. Externally may mean to senior leadership or the like, where there you're doing more to try to convey the value and the vision of the program. So they're separate sets of it, and yeah, maybe you need some help with those external ones to get buy-in for what you want to convey. But certainly for the internal ones, you can focus very squarely on what you know is going to be needed. You know, even if it's something as simple as mean time to detect, mean time to respond, that can be an internal metric that you're keeping tabs on, because you're using that to then inform what maybe your next purchase is going to be, or maybe what your next hire is going to be. So there are ways to do that. And then in part, when you're dealing with KPIs that do require data from other groups, yes, it does get more challenging. That's why I try to spend as much time as possible working with the data that is owned by the security team, and therefore can be used by the security team. And those observed steps of understanding your organization, understanding your enemy, based primarily on what you already have, what's already in your stack, that does some to eliminate the reliance on other folks. With that said, yeah, sometimes just start with what you can do internally, what you can get a quick win on, and maybe use that, leverage that to then go to those other groups. And you can say, well, look, we've been tracking this has been helpful. But if we were also tracking this with data coming from you, that would be even more helpful. So you can start small with it. And I may have lost you because I can't hear you there. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. There is one other question. Do you see the interaction with internal audit for the assurance of change management and procedures affecting execution of the security implementation?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, yeah, audits and compliance are basically what dictates the whole security program. It often depends on the tone from the top with respect to that. Whether they're taking a reactive approach where they just want to meet compliance standards, or whether they're taking a more proactive approach and they're trying to look at the threats at hand. And if you have an organization that is very heavily focused on the compliance side of it, then it becomes even more important to be able to convey the other side of it. And that may, again, be a long process to build that level of understanding, but you have to be able to articulate that, yes, I understand if we do not meet this regulatory requirement, it could cost us X. That is understood, and that's very finite. But on the flip side of it, if we neglect actually doing real security operations because we're busy with paper exercises, then our risk is three magnitudes higher. And so we really do need to address that issue, even though it's not as clear cut as if you don't do X, then you're fined Y. The reality is that the risk is much greater. The impact to the organization and its ability to serve its mission are impacted in a much more profound way if we are neglecting this.
So always keep an eye on the strategic sides. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I think
exactly.
that's great.
Exactly.
Cool. Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I just put your slides up on the agenda. So great talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much.